The sun sank behind the shattered hills, casting long shadows over the battered village, where silence felt heavier than gunfire, and every broken wall whispered stories of fear and loss. The air smelled of smoke and soil, and the distant echo of marching boots made even the bravest hearts tremble, because everyone knew the Americans were coming, and the Japanese commanders had warned that capture meant torture and death, yet hidden behind those orders were boys barely old enough to hold, rifles their hands shaking as they tried to look like soldiers, even though deep inside they were still children, longing for home, longing for warmth, longing for a future that felt impossible. As night approached, the sky turned crimson like a wound, and the wind carried the sound of distant artillery closer and closer, until it felt as if the mountains themselves were moving and no one could escape what was coming next. In the underground bunker, dug hastily beneath the remnants of a school, the young recruits sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Some stared at the dirt floor, some clutched family photos, others whispered prayers while the commanding officer paced back and forth, shouting about honor and sacrifice. But even he could not hide the fear in his voice, because the Americans were stronger, better equipped, and relentless, yet surrender was forbidden. Surrender was shame. Death was glory. That was what they had been taught every day, drilled into their minds like the cold metal of their rifles. But when a sudden blast shook, the bunker dust rained down from the ceiling, causing the boys to flinch, and one of them, a frail 14-year-old named Hiroshi, could no longer hold back the tears that burned behind his eyes, because he knew the next explosion might be the last, and he did not know if he wanted to live or die, but there was no turning back. No, Hiroshi remembered the day he was taken from his village. The officers arrived with stern faces, declaring it was his duty to defend the empire. His mother cried and begged them to let him stay, but they pulled him away, promising glory and honor. But instead, he found hunger, exhaustion, and fear. The drills were endless, the punishments brutal, and the constant reminder that Americans were monsters carved terror deeper into his soul. He had seen older boys break under pressure. He had heard screams in the night, but still he clung to a tiny spark of hope that maybe he would survive. Maybe he would return home one day. Even if he did not believe it fully, that hope kept his heart beating through the long, brutal nights until now, as the ground above them shook again and the lights flickered, sending the bunker into momentary darkness, making every boy reach instinctively for their rifles, wondering if this was the beginning of the end outside. The sky burst with fire as flares lit up the night, revealing the destroyed landscape like a battlefield. Frozen in time, American tanks rolled forward, crushing debris beneath their tracks, while soldiers moved like shadows through the smoke, their footsteps steady, their formation precise, their presence unstoppable. The Japanese scouts who watched from hidden posts trembled, knowing they had no chance to stop them. They signaled back to the bunker that the enemy was close, very close, too close. The young soldiers inside exchanged fearful glances, their hearts pounding so loudly it drowned out all other sound. The commander barked orders telling them to stand firm, to prepare, to fight, to die if necessary. But when he looked at their faces, he saw not warriors, but children. And for a brief moment, even he hesitated, wondering if sacrificing them was worth anything at all, just as the ground erupted, once more throwing everyone to the floor, and the bunker walls groaned as if they were about to collapse, leaving them trapped between duty and survival. The night stretched endlessly, each second growing heavier than the last as the boys huddled together, awaiting the inevitable clash. Every creak, every distant boom, every rumble in the earth made them flinch and whisper, what ifs? What if they ran? What if they surrendered? What if everything they had been told was a lie? Hiroshi felt his breath grow shallow, his throat dry, his hands numb around the cold rifle he had never fired in real battle. He imagined the Americans' faceless shadows ready to rip him apart, but a part of him wondered, were they truly the monsters he had been warned about? Or were they like him, Tired, scared human. His thoughts spiraled faster as footsteps thudded above the bunker louder. Closer, unstoppable, until dust rained from the ceiling and the door hinges rattled under pressure, and for a moment time froze as every boy held his breath waiting in the dark, knowing that whatever came through that door would change everything forever. And the next sound they heard made their blood run cold, because it was not an explosion. It was a voice, the voice outside. The bunker was deep, steady, and spoke in a language none of the boys fully understood. Yet the tone was calm, not aggressive, and that confused them more than any explosion could. Hiroshi pressed his ear to the cold metal door, his heartbeat roaring. In his ears, as the voice spoke again slower this time, almost as if the speaker did not want to frighten them. The commander signaled everyone to silence, holding up his hand, as the boys crouched low, gripping their rifles with trembling fingers. The air felt thick, like it might crush them. But instead of the expected blast or gunfire, there was only the sound of footsteps crunching softly over the dirt outside, and then a pause as though the strangers were waiting for something or someone. To respond, tension wrapped around every child like chains as doubts gnawed at their minds because the Americans were supposed to be ruthless killers. So why were they standing there calmly instead of storming inside? The commander's face twisted with anger and fear as he debated whether to order the boys to fire or to wait. His pride demanded resistance, but his instincts sensed something different, something he could not explain. He raised his rifle, but before he could speak, another voice called out from outside, softer, younger, almost gentle. The tone made the boys glance at each other, confused. Their training told them to hate the enemy, but this sounded nothing like the hatred they had been warned about. Hiroshi felt his knees weaken, as he realized he did not want to pull the trigger. He did not want to die or kill anyone, especially when he did not even understand why this war had taken everything from him. His home, his childhood, his freedom, firelight from distant explosions, flickered through the cracks in the bunker walls, casting moving shadows that looked like ghosts of the dead, watching them silently as if waiting to see what choice they would make. Now that fate stood at their door, the silence stretched on unbearably, long until suddenly there was a loud thud against the bunker door, making every boy flinch and aim their rifles in panic. But it was not an attempt to break in. It was something being set down gently outside. Then footsteps retreated a few paces and stopped again. The boys looked to the commander, who frowned in confusion before inching cautiously toward the door. Hiroshi held his breath as the commander slowly pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. The chill night air rushed into the bunker, carrying the scent of damp soil and the faint smell of cooked food. The commander froze, his eyes widening as he saw what had been left on the ground. A crate filled with water cans and something wrapped in cloth, possibly bread or rations. The boys stared in disbelief, their minds struggling to comprehend why the enemy would offer them supplies when they could simply wipe them out. And as the commander slowly closed the door again, the realization settled heavily in the room that the Americans were not acting like the monsters they had feared. Whispers broke out among the young soldiers. Some insisted it was a trick. Others said the Americans wanted them alive to humiliate them. Some even dared to hope it was mercy. The commander tried to regain control, yelling at them to stay focused to prepare for battle. But his voice lacked conviction because even he was shaken by the unexpected gesture. Hiroshi's heart pounded with new confusion. His entire life had been shaped by the belief that the Americans were merciless. Yet tonight, they showed restraint, kindness, even, and that terrified him more than any weapon because it meant everything he knew might be a lie. His hands trembled as he lowered his rifle slightly, ashamed of how ready he had been to kill. Without understanding the truth around him, the bunker felt smaller than ever as the boys struggled with their thoughts and the weight of the unknown. But before they could decide what to believe, a distant explosion roared across the valley, shaking the ground wildly and plunging them back into fear as darkness swallowed the faint hope that had just begun to appear. Outside, the battle elsewhere raged fiercely with gunfire echoing in the night and flares, lighting up the sky in bursts of blinding light. The Americans were advancing steadily but carefully, navigating through the ruins, searching for enemy positions without hurting civilians. Their discipline was unlike anything the child soldiers had. Imagine some American troops whispered among themselves about the young fighters they had seen earlier, some still gripping rifles too big for their bodies, others shaking with terror. The sight had haunted the Americans who had fought, hardened, soldiers across countless battlefields, but nothing had prepared them for children forced into war. One American sergeant clenched his fists in anger. Not at the children, but at whoever had commanded them into this nightmare. He ordered his men to hold fire unless absolutely necessary, refusing to let innocent blood stain their hands, even if it meant taking greater risks as they approached the bunkers with caution and empathy instead of fire and fury back. Inside the bunker, the tension became unbearable as the explosions moved further away, leaving only distant echoes. The commander paced with restless frustration, unable to decide their next move. Fight, surrender, hide. He told himself surrender was weakness, but deep down, he feared leading the boys into a hopeless battle. More so, he feared what would remain of his own soul if he forced them to die for nothing. Hiroshi watched him struggling with inner conflict for the first time, seeing the commander not as a symbol of authority but as a human man trapped in his own duty. The boys waited nervously, glancing at the door at each other, at their shaking hands, and then, without warning, a loud knock echoed through the bunker door, firm, but not violent, confident, but not cruel. Every head snapped toward the sound, and a cold wave of silence washed across the room as they froze in place, knowing that this moment would decide their fate, and the next words, spoken from outside, made their blood run cold, because it was not a threat. It was an invitation. The voice spoke slowly in broken Japanese, telling them they did not have to fight, telling them they would not be harmed if they came out, telling them they could live. The words hung in the air like distant bells, unreal, impossible, unbelievable. Some boys looked hopeful, others suspicious. A few silently cried. The commander stood motionless. His jaw clenched, his eyes dark with turmoil. Hiroshi felt his heart ache with fear and longing all at once. The idea of laying down his rifle felt like betraying everything he had been taught, but the idea of survival felt like a miracle he never thought possible. The voice continued gently, waiting patiently as if it truly cared what happened to them, and that made the boys question everything they had ever believed about the enemy and themselves. The world felt like it was tipping on its axis, forcing them to choose between death in the name of pride or life in the face of truth. And as the commander slowly stepped toward the door to respond, the bunker grew so quiet that every breath sounded like thunder, and the next second shattered everything as the door handle began to turn from the other side on its own, leaving them paralyzed in the moment just before history changed forever. The door creaked open slowly as if time itself hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or remain frozen in the moment. And every child inside the bunker felt their breath catch in their throat as the gap widened, revealing the silhouette of an American soldier standing in the dim moonlight. His hands raised empty of any weapon, his posture calm, steady, unthreatening behind him. Faint lantern light flickered over tired faces of other soldiers who waited quietly, their rifles slung over their shoulders, not pointed at anyone. The silence was so deep that even the soft rustle of fabric sounded deafening. The Japanese commander stepped forward, instinctively blocking the boys with his arm. His eyes locked on the American, unsure whether to attack or speak, but the American did something none of them expected. He bowed slightly, a respectful gesture that made the entire bunker erupt with confusion because it shattered every belief they had clung to about the enemy and left them unsure of what was real anymore. As the American lifted his head, his eyes met the commander's, and in that gaze there was no hatred, only understanding, and that terrified them more than Any weapon ever could. The American spoke again in broken Japanese, saying they did not want to kill them, saying they were only here to end the war, saying the boys were too young to die, and each word struck the child soldiers like thunder in their hearts because no one had ever told them they were too young. No one had ever protected them before. The commander hesitated, gripping his rifle tightly, sweat dripping down his neck, his mind racing through loyalty, duty, pride, but the weight of the rifles behind him, the sight of the trembling boys and the gentle yet firm voice of the American pressed against his resolve like an invisible force. Hiroshi watched every second, feeling his own heart pound with hope and terror as he wondered what choice the commander would make, and whether that choice would decide if they lived or died within the next breath. But before the commander could speak, another boy suddenly stood up from the back, his shoulders shaking, his face pale, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "I do not want to die." The room fell silent. The commander turned slowly, his eyes filled with shock and something deeper that resembled sorrow. The boy who had spoken looked at the floor, ashamed but determined, tears sliding down his cheeks as he clenched his fists and repeated, "I do not want to die." Several other boys looked up, their expressions mirroring his fear and desperation. One by one, they nodded, some whispering agreement, some barely able to speak. The truth was no longer hidden beneath duty. It was raw and undeniable. None of them wanted to die, not for honor, not for pride, not for lies. The commander's rifle lowered slightly as the weight of their truth crushed the chains of propaganda he had lived under for so long. He looked at the American standing calmly at the doorway, then at the children who trusted him with their lives, and for the first time he saw the path clearly, even if it cost him everything. He took a deep breath, his voice shaking as he spoke to the American in a low, tense tone, demanding to know their intentions, needing some assurance before making the most difficult decision of his life. As the American listened quietly and then stepped forward with open hands, the air tightened. Because everyone knew they stood on the edge of something irreversible, the American reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out something unexpected. A small photograph worn around the edges. He held it out carefully, and the commander reluctantly took it. Glancing down at the picture, it showed the American soldier with two young children smiling in a sunlit field. A family picture, a reminder of peace, of love, of normal life. The commander stared at it silently, his hand trembling, because in that moment, he understood this man was also a father or brother. Someone who valued life, not a monster, as they had been told. The American pointed to the boys behind the commander, then gently touched his chest, then pointed to the children in the photo. The message was clear. "I protect my children. Let me protect yours." The commander closed his eyes, a wave of emotion crashing over him, and when he opened them again, his rifle hung uselessly by his side as he finally whispered words that felt like breaking free. He said, "We surrender." The boys gasped, some in relief, some in disbelief, and as the American stepped forward, slowly ready to help rather than harm, the tension in the bunker cracked like ice. But just when it seemed like the nightmare might end, a sudden explosion roared in the distance, shaking the earth and filling the air with smoke, snapping everyone back into danger. The Americans reacted instantly, raising their rifles, scanning the surroundings, ready for an ambush. They motioned for the boys to stay low as they moved to shield them instead of attacking them. The child soldiers stared in confusion because the enemy was now protecting them. Hiroshi crawled forward and peeked outside, seeing flames rising from another part of the valley where fighting still raged. The war was not over outside these walls, and any stray bullet could end them all. The American sergeant barked orders to his men, positioning them strategically while reassuring the Japanese boys that they were safe. Hiroshi could not understand all the words, but the tone was steady, confident, the kind of voice that made you believe that maybe everything would be all right. The commander stepped out beside the sergeant, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had been his enemy only minutes before together. They scanned the battlefield, united by a shared mission to keep the children alive, even if it meant facing their own armies. Wrath, the boys watched from the bunker entrance, their fear shifting into something new, something dangerous but powerful. Hope. The Americans signaled it was time to move. The bunker was no longer safe. They had to evacuate quietly before the fighting drew closer. The commander helped, organized the boys, telling them to leave their rifles behind. Some hesitated, gripping their weapons as if they were their only identity, but eventually they let go, allowing the metal to clatter softly onto the ground like chains falling from their souls. Hiroshi felt his hands suddenly lighter, his heart racing with uncertainty as he stepped out into the cool night air, following the Americans through the shadows. Each step away from the bunker felt like stepping away from everything he had ever known. The path was uneven, littered with debris, and the distant echo of gunfire made every movement tense. But the soldiers guided them, carefully shielding them when necessary, giving them water, supporting those who stumbled. The boys exchanged nervous glances, whispering questions none of them could answer. Why were they being treated with kindness? Why did the Americans care what would happen to them now? The unknown loomed ahead, as wide as the night sky, and yet none of them turned back as they reached a safer ridge overlooking the valley. The Americans halted, positioning themselves in a protective circle around the children. The moonlight illuminated their faces, revealing exhaustion, but also determination. These men had seen the horrors of war, yet still chose compassion. The Japanese commander stood silently, watching the sergeant, who was speaking into a radio, likely coordinating with other units. Hiroshi approached slowly, his curiosity stronger than his fear, and the sergeant noticed him, offering a tired but reassuring nod. Hiroshi hesitated, then pointed at himself and said his name. The sergeant repeated it gently, then pointed at his own chest and said, "Thomas." The moment was small but powerful. A bridge built between two worlds that had once been enemies. The other boys followed, sharing their names with the Americans, who tried to pronounce them, some correctly, some clumsily, but always respectfully. Laughter, even if soft and brief, echoed through the night like the first sign of life after a long winter, melting away years of hatred with something as simple as a smile. Yet just as the air began to feel lighter, a sudden crack of gunfire erupted nearby, forcing everyone to drop to the ground as bullets whistled over their heads, reminding them that the war was not done with them yet, and the darkness ahead hid dangers they could not see, leaving their fate once again hanging by a thread. The sharp whistle of bullets slicing through the night forced everyone flat against the ground as dirt sprayed into the air, and the once quiet ridge turned into a deadly zone of chaos. The American soldiers moved instantly, forming a shield around the unarmed boys, shouting for them to stay low while scanning the darkness for the source of the attack. The boys trembled, their hearts pounding as they pressed their faces into the cold earth, fear returning like a storm, crashing through their fragile sense of safety. Hiroshi could hear his own heartbeat louder than the gunfire, each shot reminding him that survival was still uncertain, that mercy did not guarantee safety. The Japanese commander crawled closer to the sergeant, asking if the attackers were Americans, but the sergeant shook his head grimly. These were remnants of Japanese forces still fighting, refusing to surrender, desperate and dangerous. The cruel irony hit the boys hard. Their own countrymen were now the threat, not the enemy they had been taught to hate. The ridge offered little protection as the gunfire intensified, ricocheting off rocks, sending sparks into the air. The Americans slowly pulled the boys back behind a cluster of boulders, trying to buy time. The sergeant shouted into his radio, calling for support, but the connection crackled with static, leaving them isolated. The boys huddled together, some praying, some crying, some staring blankly into the night, too exhausted to even feel fear. Hiroshi felt the ground shake as another explosion erupted in the distance, the sound rolling over the hills like thunder. The Americans exchanged tense looks, understanding that if the enemy troops reached their position, the children would be caught in the crossfire, or worse, the sergeant crawled over to the commander and told him they had to move deeper into safer territory. But the path ahead was steep, narrow, and exposed. One mistake could send them tumbling into the chaos below. Yet staying here meant death. The decision was clear. Even if it was terrifying, with urgency in his voice, the sergeant instructed the commander to lead the boys single file, while his men covered the rear. Every muscle in Hiroshi's body screamed with exhaustion, but he forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking as he followed the commander along the narrow mountain path. The moon cast a pale glow on the ground, revealing jagged rocks and loose gravel that threatened to slip under every step. The wind howled across the cliffs, cold and merciless, as if trying to push them back. The sound of distant gunfire continued echoing through the night, chasing them like a phantom. The Americans moved carefully, scanning every shadow, every ridge alert for ambushes, ready to risk their lives for boys, who yesterday were their enemies. The boys looked back often, watching the soldiers cover them with unwavering focus, and something deep inside them shifted as they realized this was not strategy or manipulation. It was protection, genuine and fearless as they climbed higher into the mountain pass. The path narrowed until only one person could move at a time, forcing everyone to rely on the person ahead and trust they would not fall. Hiroshi could hear the labored breathing of the boys behind him, feel their fear, like a pulse in the air, but also their determination to keep going, one step, one breath, one moment at a time. The commander led steadily despite the danger. His presence reassuring even in the dark, he glanced back occasionally, meeting the eyes of the sergeant with unspoken trust, a connection forged in the fire of survival. Suddenly a flare shot into the sky, bathing the mountains in harsh white light. The boys froze, their shadows stretching like ghosts across the rocks. The moment felt endless. Then the sergeant shouted for them to move faster. The flare meant they had been spotted and enemies were closing in. The boys pushed forward with renewed urgency, their feet slipping, their lungs burning as panic surged through them. Path finally widened into a small plateau, offering temporary safety. But the relief was short-lived, as the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps echoed from below. Growing louder with each second, the sergeant ordered his men into defensive positions while telling the commander to keep the boys back. Hiroshi watched in awe as American soldiers took cover with calm precision, their eyes steady, their movements controlled. Even in the face of danger, the boys clung to each other, shivering. In the cold night air, unsure of what would happen if the enemy reached them, would they be captured, forced back into battle, or killed for surrendering? The thought made Hiroshi's stomach twist as dread wrapped around him, tightening with every passing heartbeat. The commander crouched beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, telling him quietly to be brave, to trust the Americans to survive no matter what. Because there was no going back now, the footsteps grew closer. Rocks shifting under, boots, voices murmuring in the dark. The Americans raised their weapons, ready to defend the children at all costs. Tension crackled through the air like electricity, every second stretching longer than the last. Hiroshi held his breath, his eyes locked, on the edge of the plateau, waiting to see who would emerge, a friend or a foe. Silence followed. Then a shadow appeared at the ridge, and the next moment determined everything, as a figure stepped into the light, and the truth of who had found them was revealed, leaving their fate hanging on a single heartbeat. The shadow stepped fully into view, and the moonlight revealed a Japanese officer, his uniform torn, his face hardened by desperation. And behind him came several soldiers, armed and determined, their eyes burning with defiance. The boys gasped, recognizing the insignia of a regiment known for refusing surrender. The officer stared at the scene, confusion and fury twisting his expression. As he saw the children protected by Americans, he shouted, demanding to know why the boys had abandoned their posts, why they stood beside the enemy. His voice thundered with rage, calling them traitors, cowards, dishonorable. The boys trembled, some lowering their heads in shame, others clinging to the Americans. In fear, the officer raised his pistol, aiming it at the commander, accusing him of betrayal. The commander stood tall, his voice calm but firm as he said, "The boys were children, not soldiers, and he would not let them die." The officer's hand shook with anger as he prepared to fire, but before the shot rang out, the sergeant stepped forward, placing himself between the commander and the gun, a silent promise that he would die to protect them for a long, tense moment. No one moved the mountains, held their breath. The night stood still. The officer's finger slowly tightened on the trigger, but his eyes flicked to the boys, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. No hatred in their eyes, only exhaustion and fear. The lies he had believed, the glory he had chased suddenly felt hollow. Something inside him cracked like ice under pressure, and his hand wavered, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. The boys watched silently, waiting to see if mercy or violence would decide their fate. The wind whispered across the plateau, carrying the distant echoes of war, and the officer slowly lowered his weapon, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of everything finally crushed him. He turned away, refusing to meet their eyes, signaling his men. To withdraw, they hesitated, confused, but followed him into the darkness, leaving only silence behind. The Americans slowly lowered their rifles, the tension melting into relief as the boys collapsed to their knees, overwhelmed by the narrow escape. Some cried openly, others stared at the ground in disbelief. The sergeant helped the commander stand and nodded respectfully. The war around them was still raging, but in this moment peace had won, in the hearts of those who mattered. The boys were guided down the mountain to safety, where they received warm food, clean blankets, and gentle words instead of punishment and pain. They were treated like human beings for the first time in what felt like forever. Days later, the war ended, and the boys were allowed to return home carrying memories. They would never forget they had walked into battle as enemies, but survived as living proof that even in the darkest moments, compassion can shatter. Hatred, mercy can silence guns, and kindness can save the souls that war tries to destroy.